The arrival. Commander Alicia Turner's steps echoed across the polished floor of Easton International Airport as she weaved her way through the bustling crowd. The noise of the terminal, shuffling feet, the clinking of luggage wheels, the chatter of passengers, was a sound she had almost forgotten after weeks at sea. As much as she loved the quiet of the open ocean, there was something grounding about being back in the thick of humanity, surrounded by the hum of life that seemed both chaotic and comforting at once. It was the kind of noise she had missed. A stark contrast to the silence of the water where her only company had been her thoughts and the occasional communication from her team. The constant vigilance of her duties on the mission had meant few moments for rest, only brief pockets of peace when the storm would quiet, or when the ship would make its way through calm waters. Now, stepping off that ship and into the airport felt like walking into another world, a world where she could, at least for a moment, forget the endless hours spent scanning the horizon, ready to respond to any emergency that might arise. Alicia shifted her bag on her shoulder and let out a quiet sigh of relief. The soft rumble of the crowd around her became white noise as she let herself slip into the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air, mingling with the sweet scent of bakery pastries. Children ran past her, laughing as they played with their parents, and she couldn't help but smile softly. It was a fleeting feeling, this longing for simplicity. After months of navigating life-or-death situations, watching people's lives hang by a thread, the normal, everyday existence of others felt like a distant, yet comforting, reminder of what life could be. Alicia's phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out, scanning the screen. The notification read, "First class seat confirmed." A simple message, but it held more weight than it should have. She had been given a rare opportunity, a chance to experience a little comfort after weeks of exhaustion. She had earned this, without a doubt. Being away from her family, friends, and the simple pleasures of home for so long had made her realize how much she cherished the ordinary things. Sitting in a spacious seat, having the space to stretch her legs, and savoring a warm meal were luxuries she rarely allowed herself. For a moment, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she thought of the small indulgences ahead of her, a glass of wine, perhaps, or the rare opportunity to actually sleep on a plane instead of worrying about mission reports or preparing for another potentially hazardous situation. As she walked toward the terminal's gate, a sense of anticipation began to take root inside her. It wasn't often that she got to experience these comforts, and she wasn't going to take them for granted. Despite the weariness she felt from the grueling weeks of work, there was a sense of pride in her posture as she walked. Alicia knew that her demeanor reflected the years of training and discipline that had become second nature. She carried herself with the kind of authority that was earned, not demanded, and it was impossible not to notice her. People in the terminal seemed to instinctively clear a path as she passed. The uniform, her crisp, dark blue Coast Guard attire, spoke volumes without her needing to utter a word. The medals, the stripes, the insignia, they all told a story of sacrifice, of leadership, and of years spent in service of something greater than herself. Alicia wasn't one to seek attention or accolades. She didn't wear her accomplishments like badges of honor, and her unassuming nature often led people to underestimate her. But she had long ago come to understand that the work she did, the life she led, would always speak louder than anything she could say. And in that moment, walking through the airport, her presence commanded the respect she had earned through every mission, every decision, and every challenge she had faced. As she neared the check-in counter, she couldn't help but notice the soft murmurs around her. A couple of children pointed excitedly at her, whispering to their parents, and some travelers watched with admiration, clearly recognizing the importance of her uniform. But Alicia didn't acknowledge the attention. She had long ago learned that it was the silent moments, the times when she was just another person in the crowd, that were the most valuable to her. She had always believed that true leadership came from action, not recognition. The airline attendant at the counter looked up, her face lighting up when she saw Alicia's uniform. She immediately stood a little straighter. "Good afternoon, Commander Turner," the young woman said, her voice carrying a note of respect. "It's an honor to have you with us today. I've confirmed your first-class seat, and everything looks set for your flight." Alicia nodded, her smile polite but reserved. "Thank you. It's good to be heading home." The attendant's eyes lingered on her for a brief moment before she quickly looked down at her computer screen again. There was a slight tension in her posture, but Alicia paid it little mind. She was used to that kind of reaction when people recognized her rank. The acknowledgement was both a privilege and a burden. People often treated her differently because of it, though Alicia had never quite gotten used to it. After receiving her boarding pass, Alicia made her way toward security. She was looking forward to the quietness of first class, a place where she could finally sit back and relax, away from the demands of her uniform. As she passed through the metal detector and retrieved her bag, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of guilt for being relieved to leave behind her responsibilities for just a few hours. Her thoughts returned to the mission she had just completed. It had been one of the most intense assignments she had ever led, involving a massive rescue operation off the coast. She and her crew had worked tirelessly, often without sleep, in treacherous waters. The lives they had saved felt like victories, but the toll it took on everyone was undeniable. The exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, and her body longed for rest. Finally, she reached the gate for her flight. The boarding process had already begun, and passengers were beginning to line up. Alicia's first-class seat was ready and waiting for her, and she could feel the anticipation building inside. She had earned it. After all, the few moments of peace she could find in a world constantly in motion were precious, and she wasn't going to let anything take that from her. As she waited in line, her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her daughter. The text was simple: "Can't wait for you to come home, Mom. I miss you so much." Alicia's heart warmed as she read the words. She missed Maya more than she could express. There had been too many missed birthdays, anniversaries, and family dinners. But those little messages from her daughter always made the sacrifices worthwhile. The gate agent's voice called out over the intercom, announcing the last boarding call for first-class passengers. Alicia took a deep breath, glanced down at her phone one last time, and then headed toward the jetway, ready to board the plane that would take her home. But as she approached the gate, she felt the faintest ripple of unease, though she couldn't quite place its source. Something wasn't right. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift that caught her attention. She wasn't sure what it was, but she had learned to trust her instincts. There was something ahead of her, something waiting, that would test her resolve once again. And she was ready for it. The encounter. The slight unease that tugged at Alicia's gut as she approached the boarding gate only seemed to grow the closer she came to the desk. The terminal, filled with the typical hum of travelers, seemed to pulse around her as the sea of people moved and swirled. Her first-class ticket, which should have been a simple step into comfort, felt suddenly like a ticket to an unknown territory. Something in the air felt off, though it was hard to pinpoint exactly what it was. Alicia steadied her breath as she approached the gate attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile that seemed a little too wide, like a mask trying to conceal something. She greeted Alicia warmly, but there was something in the way her gaze flicked toward the side, where another airline staff member stood, watching intently. The flicker of hesitation was subtle but not missed by Alicia's trained eyes. "Commander Turner," the attendant said, her voice laced with a slight note of reverence. "Your seat is ready. We've been expecting you. If you'd like, you can board now." Alicia nodded, giving a courteous but nonchalant smile as she handed the attendant her boarding pass. The attendant swiped it through the scanner, but instead of immediately handing it back, she hesitated. For a moment, Alicia wondered if there was an issue with the ticket, perhaps a glitch in the system. But the uneasy look the attendant exchanged with the colleague standing nearby piqued her curiosity. "Is something wrong?" Alicia asked, her voice calm, but her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the situation. The attendant blinked, as though jolted from her thoughts. "No, nothing at all, Commander." Her words came out too quickly, betraying the uncertainty in her tone. "It's just that, well, we've had a last-minute request regarding your seat. There seems to be a bit of confusion about the assignment." Alicia's brows furrowed as she shifted her weight slightly. "Confusion?" she repeated, a cold edge entering her voice. She wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to what was rightfully hers. "I was confirmed for first class. It was already arranged." The attendant opened her mouth to respond, but she was quickly interrupted by the sudden appearance of a man, tall, with sharp features and a well-groomed appearance. He wore an air of quiet authority that seemed to emanate from him. His uniform, a flight manager's attire, was crisply pressed, and his calm, confident demeanor only added to the sense that something larger was unfolding. "Commander Turner?" the man asked, his voice smooth but edged with an underlying tension. His eyes flicked briefly to the young attendant before settling back on Alicia. "I'm Flight Manager Eric Townsend. There's been a slight issue with your seat assignment. If you'll allow me to explain, we've been instructed to make accommodations for a passenger who's been given priority." Alicia's expression tightened. She had long since learned that priority often meant something or someone had more influence, more clout, more perceived importance than she did. The words had an unmistakable ring to them. She'd been in enough high-stress situations to understand that this wasn't about a simple mistake, it was about something else entirely. The abruptness of the interaction, the sense of urgency in his tone, left her with no doubt that this was more than just a scheduling error. "I don't believe I need an explanation," Alicia replied, her voice controlled but carrying the weight of her years of service. "I've been confirmed for this seat for quite some time. If there's been a mix-up, I trust it can be sorted out." Flight Manager Townsend maintained his calm facade, but Alicia could see the faintest flicker of discomfort in his eyes. His smile was tight, and his posture was stiff, an indication of someone caught in a situation they hadn't anticipated. "I'm afraid, Commander, that this is beyond the usual procedure," Townsend continued, his voice lowering slightly. "The passenger in question is a VIP with high-level government connections, and we have been instructed to upgrade their seating arrangement. We need to reassign your seat to accommodate them." Alicia's heart tightened. The mention of a VIP, coupled with the hint of political ties, sent a sharp warning through her mind. She had faced situations like this before, where the rules bent for the sake of influential people. But she wasn't going to be swept aside, not today, not for anyone. "I'm sorry, Mr. Townsend, but that doesn't change the facts," she said, standing her ground. "I was confirmed for that seat, and I will be sitting there." The air around them seemed to freeze. There was a brief pause where Alicia felt the gaze of every other passenger in the boarding area shift toward her. The subtle but distinct shift in energy wasn't lost on her. She wasn't sure how many of them knew who she was, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about showing off her rank or her position, this was about fairness. About dignity. "I understand your position, Commander," Townsend said, his smile now fully gone, replaced by something more rigid. "But we cannot simply ignore the instructions from upper management. I'm sure you understand the gravity of the situation." Alicia's brow arched. "I do understand," she said, her voice as cool as the ocean breeze she'd gotten used to. "But I also understand my rights, and I'm not about to be displaced because someone with more influence wants a seat. That seat was assigned to me, and I've earned it. I'm not moving." The tension in the air grew thicker. Alicia could see that Townsend was calculating the best way to respond, no doubt weighing the consequences of pushing her further. She stood tall, her posture unwavering, not willing to back down an inch. The years of military service had taught her one vital lesson: sometimes, standing your ground was the only thing that kept your integrity intact. Townsend's eyes flicked nervously between Alicia and the attendant, who was still standing silently nearby, her gaze averted. The seconds stretched into minutes as he appeared to contemplate his next move. Alicia wasn't about to give him the space to back down. He needed to understand that this was a matter of principle, not just protocol. Before he could respond, the door behind him opened, and a tall man in a tailored suit entered the area. He exuded an air of importance that could not be ignored, his presence commanding attention from everyone in the vicinity. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, a deliberate sound that echoed in the silence. Alicia didn't need to be told who he was. The way the staff looked at him, the way they stood a little straighter, this man was the VIP. The one who was supposed to take her seat. The newcomer's eyes landed on Alicia, and for a moment, he seemed to study her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something faintly dismissive. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable note of entitlement. Alicia didn't flinch, meeting his gaze with an unyielding stare. "There's no problem," she said coolly. "Except that I've been assigned a seat, and I intend to sit in it." The VIP's expression shifted imperceptibly. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone now laced with condescension. "I've been given a much more important seat on this flight. And your seat, well, I need it." Alicia took a deep breath. She had faced far worse than this, but something about this moment, this interaction, felt different. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about something much larger, the invisible line that determined who was important and who was not. The kind of world where rank was less about duty and more about power. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. "I understand perfectly," Alicia replied, her voice steady but firm. "But I've earned my seat. And I will be sitting there." The VIP's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Alicia saw a flicker of irritation cross his face. He was not used to being challenged, not used to having to fight for what he wanted. His gaze shifted toward Townsend, silently requesting that the situation be resolved in his favor. But Townsend's expression faltered as he met Alicia's gaze, realizing that this wasn't a fight he could easily win. "I'm afraid this will require further assistance," the VIP muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. Alicia didn't break her gaze. She was ready to stand her ground, no matter what came next. She had faced danger on the high seas, staring down impossible odds, but this? This was about something more personal, something more important. It was about her right to be respected, not because of her title, but because of the values she stood for. "Do what you must," she said quietly. "But I'm not moving." The stage was set, and Alicia was ready for whatever came next. The standoff. The silence that settled over the boarding area after Alicia's firm statement was thick with anticipation. The VIP's sharp gaze bore into her, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused. The flight manager, Townsend, visibly hesitated. He glanced between Alicia and the man in the expensive suit, clearly caught between a rock and a hard place. In the world of airport politics, the VIP's request, though unreasonable, often took precedence. Alicia could sense the tension in the air. It was a familiar feeling, one that often accompanied situations where power dynamics overshadowed basic fairness. But this wasn't just about a seat. It was about dignity, and Alicia wasn't about to let herself be bulldozed because someone with influence thought they could buy respect. The VIP, his jaw clenched, took a small step forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. His presence was imposing, like someone accustomed to being obeyed. The power in his posture was undeniable, and yet, there was an underlying uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged in this way. Alicia could almost hear the mental calculations running through his mind, weighing the consequences of pushing her too far. His hand twitched as if he were about to gesture toward his seat, but he held back, unsure whether it would be worth the confrontation. "Commander Turner," the VIP said, his voice smooth but now tinged with a more insistent tone. "I don't think you understand the situation. I'm on a mission that requires utmost comfort and privacy. It's imperative that I take your seat." His words were veiled in a thin layer of politeness, but the underlying arrogance was unmistakable. He wasn't asking, he was commanding. Alicia's eyes narrowed as she met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice calm but filled with an edge that betrayed her growing frustration. "But I'm not in the habit of relinquishing what I've earned. Your mission, whatever it is, doesn't change the fact that I was confirmed for that seat. You'll have to find another." A flicker of annoyance crossed the VIP's face, and he took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself. "This isn't just about your seat, Commander. It's about something far more significant. I'm not sure you fully comprehend who you're dealing with." Alicia's mind raced for a moment. She could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't sway her. She had been in high-stakes situations before, missions where the rules didn't apply, where she had to navigate political landscapes and corporate interests to save lives. She was no stranger to power plays. But this? This was different. This wasn't about a life-or-death situation, this was about respect. The kind that had to be earned, not given out of convenience. "I don't care who you are or what mission you're on," Alicia said, her voice unwavering. "What matters is that I've been confirmed for this seat. You're not going to bully your way into taking it. I'm not moving." Her stance was resolute, but beneath her calm exterior, Alicia's heart raced. She wasn't used to being in these kinds of confrontations, especially in a public setting. But she had been raised with the understanding that strength came not from power, but from principles. She could feel the eyes of the passengers around her, watching this exchange unfold. It was almost as if they were waiting for her to give in, to back down to the pressure. But Alicia had been in far more dangerous and challenging situations. She wasn't about to let the intimidation of a man in a suit get the best of her. Flight Manager Townsend cleared his throat, his voice low and hesitant. "Perhaps we can find a solution that satisfies both parties," he said, glancing between Alicia and the VIP. "Commander, I'm sure there's another seat available for you. We can accommodate you." Alicia's eyes flicked toward Townsend, her gaze hardening. She had known this moment was coming, the inevitable attempt to push her into compliance. But she wasn't about to give in. "I've been in enough accommodations to know when I'm being accommodated," Alicia said firmly. "I don't need another seat. I need the one I was promised." The VIP's patience seemed to wear thin. He let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly annoyed. "This is becoming a waste of time," he muttered, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of the counter. "You don't understand who I am, do you?" Alicia's eyes flashed, and she took a small step forward, narrowing the gap between them. "You think because you wear a suit and have a title that you can push people around? I'm not here to play games. I'm not going to be your pawn, and I'm not going to let you treat me like one." There was a brief, taut silence. The people around them were beginning to notice the escalating tension. A few passengers exchanged whispered words, but no one dared to intervene directly. It was as though the entire airport had collectively held its breath, waiting for the resolution of the standoff. Townsend shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension. His role as a mediator was supposed to be simple, to manage situations like this, to keep the peace and ensure the smooth operation of the flight. But he could feel the pressure building, and it wasn't the kind of pressure that could be easily diffused with a few polite words. Alicia, however, wasn't willing to be polite. She had long since learned that politeness only worked when both sides respected each other. In this case, respect was something that needed to be earned. The VIP's lips tightened, and for a moment, Alicia thought he might snap. But then, he seemed to make a decision. He took a step back and looked at Townsend with a cold, calculated expression. "I'll have my assistant speak to your higher-ups," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I'll make sure this is handled appropriately." The words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat that spoke volumes. Alicia could tell that the man was used to getting his way, used to having others bend to his will. But she wasn't about to let him succeed this time. "You do that," she replied coolly. "But just remember, I'm not the one who needs to be handled. You are." The VIP shot her one last glare before turning on his heel, striding off toward the gate with Townsend reluctantly following behind. Alicia watched them go, her jaw clenched. This wasn't over. She could feel it in her bones. There was something about this situation, something larger at play, and she wasn't going to let it slip away without getting to the bottom of it. As the VIP disappeared into the crowd, Alicia turned back toward the gate, her mind still racing. The passengers, who had been watching the drama unfold, began to resume their activities, but the air remained thick with unspoken words. Alicia didn't care about the whispers, the stares, or the judgment. She had done what was right. And no matter how powerful the man in the suit was, no matter who he thought he was, Alicia wasn't going to let him walk over her, or anyone else. A few minutes later, the boarding call for first-class passengers rang out once more. This time, Alicia didn't wait for anyone to tell her it was her turn. She walked forward with confidence, her stride purposeful. There was no question in her mind about what she needed to do. Her seat, her rightful place, was waiting for her. And she was determined to take it, the resolution. The boarding area was slowly starting to empty, the hum of conversation replacing the earlier tension as passengers filtered onto the plane. Alicia stood at the gate for a few moments, her posture still firm, her eyes scanning the boarding line for any sign of further interference. She wasn't naive enough to believe the confrontation was over. Not by a long shot. She knew that if this wasn't resolved in her favor, the repercussions could be far-reaching. This wasn't simply about a seat on a plane. It was about something more fundamental, her right to stand her ground, to demand the respect she was owed as a military officer and as a person. As she stepped forward to board the plane, the flight attendants greeted her with professional smiles, but there was a subtle undertone of discomfort in their expressions. They had clearly seen the tension between her and the VIP. They'd witnessed his attempts to have her displaced, and they knew that such things didn't happen without repercussions. Alicia nodded curtly to the attendants, aware of the eyes that followed her every movement as she made her way down the jet bridge. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire situation was pressing down on her. But it wasn't the physical weight that concerned her. It was the invisible, unspoken expectation to simply back down. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her waver. The plane's first-class cabin was a sanctuary of calm. Soft lighting, plush seats, and the faint smell of fresh linen welcomed her. Alicia had earned this, earned the comfort that came with these quiet seats, the calm after her weeks at sea, the brief respite before the next challenge. The flight attendant who escorted her to her seat gestured to the window side, where her assigned seat waited. But as Alicia took the few steps toward it, her gaze flicked to the aisle, where she noticed a couple of things. First, the VIP was already seated in the row across from hers, a smug expression plastered on his face as he looked up from his phone. And second, there was a tall, burly man standing just inside the galley, the unmistakable posture of security about him. It wasn't unusual to see security on flights, but Alicia couldn't help but feel like his presence was too purposeful, too direct. She paused at the seat, her fingers brushing the armrest, but her attention remained focused on the situation unfolding before her. A flash of annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly replaced it with a mask of calm. The battle wasn't over, it had only shifted, and Alicia knew it would take more than her willpower to make sure she wasn't moved again. Before she could sit, the same flight manager, Townsend, appeared at her side, a nervous look on his face. He motioned for her to step aside, away from her seat. "Commander," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "I believe we need to speak." Alicia's eyes flicked toward the VIP, whose gaze met hers with a cold, calculating stare. He hadn't bothered to stand up or offer any acknowledgement, his casual dismissal of her presence making her blood boil. "Speak," Alicia replied, her voice as even as she could manage, though the edge of frustration was still there. "What more is there to discuss?" Townsend shifted awkwardly, his gaze flicking between her and the VIP. "It's just that," he began, but Alicia cut him off with a sharp look. "I'm not here to play games," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You've already tried to move me once. That didn't work, and I'm not about to let it happen again." There was a long pause. The security guard standing in the galley moved a little closer, his presence making the tension palpable. Alicia could feel the unease in the air, the weight of the conflict between her and the VIP looming over everyone. Townsend glanced over his shoulder at the VIP before looking back at Alicia, his expression unreadable. "You're a strong woman, Commander," he said, his voice softer now, as though he were trying to find a way to ease the situation. "But the request for this seat is coming from a higher authority. It's out of my hands." Alicia's eyebrows furrowed. "A higher authority?" she asked, incredulous. "You mean someone with enough influence to bypass what's right?" The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Townsend flinched but said nothing. Alicia could see the discomfort in his posture. He was a man caught between two worlds, one that demanded duty, and another that demanded subservience to the powerful. "Commander," Townsend continued, almost pleading now, "please understand. This isn't about you. It's about following orders. You don't know the full scope of what's happening here." Alicia's gaze hardened. "I don't need to know the full scope," she replied. "What I need is for you to understand that I have every right to this seat. If you're asking me to leave it, then you're asking me to let myself be disrespected. And that's something I will not tolerate." A deep, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Townsend's lips, as if he had been bracing himself for this moment. He didn't want to be in this position, and Alicia could see that. But duty was duty. And she wasn't about to let him use that as an excuse. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just let me try to resolve this quietly. The less attention we draw to this, the better." Alicia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood there for a long moment, her arms crossed over her chest as she watched the VIP out of the corner of her eye. His eyes never left her, but there was something different about his expression now. A flicker of uncertainty, just for a moment, before he masked it again with his usual smirk. "I'm not moving," Alicia finally said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Do what you must, but I will remain in this seat." Townsend opened his mouth to argue, but Alicia didn't give him the chance. She walked to her seat, sitting down with the same authority she had used on the deck of a ship during rescue operations, when lives were on the line. The seat was hers. And nothing was going to change that. As she buckled her seatbelt, her thoughts began to whirl. She was ready for anything, another confrontation, a confrontation with someone far higher up than Townsend. She didn't know how far this would go, but she was ready to see it through. She would fight for her place, no matter what it cost her. As the plane began to board the remaining passengers, Alicia leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin. Despite the unease, the murmurs of discontent from the other passengers were almost soothing. She could sense their silent support, their acknowledgement of her fight. It wasn't just about the seat anymore, it was about something bigger, the right to stand her ground, to demand respect. A moment later, the door closed, and the engine started to roar as the plane taxied down the runway. Alicia's heart still beat with the adrenaline of the confrontation, but as the plane lifted into the air, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had won this round. But she knew that the battle for respect would continue long after the wheels of this plane had touched down. The real test of her strength would come when the plane landed. Would the VIP accept defeat gracefully, or would he try to wield his influence again? And what about the larger forces at play, the ones who had orchestrated this move from the beginning? Alicia couldn't predict what would come next, but she wasn't going to let anyone define her by their terms. She was in control of her own fate. And no one, not even the powerful or the influential, could take that from her. The unraveling. The flight was long, a seemingly endless stretch of time that felt like both a sanctuary and a battleground. As the plane soared above the clouds, Alicia couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her chest. Despite the calming hum of the engines and the luxury of the first-class cabin around her, her mind was racing. There were too many unanswered questions, too many angles she hadn't yet explored. It wasn't just about the seat. It had never been about the seat. She had sensed from the moment she stepped onto the plane that this situation wasn't just an isolated incident. There were powerful forces at work here, shadowy entities whose reach extended far beyond this small airport, far beyond the boundaries of the flight she now sat on. The man in the suit, the VIP who had tried so hard to displace her, wasn't simply a wealthy passenger with a sense of entitlement. He was a symbol of something larger, something Alicia hadn't fully understood, but she knew she had to figure out. The VIP had left the cabin shortly after the confrontation, his departure marked by an icy glare in Alicia's direction, as though he were certain that this wasn't the end of things. And as the flight had progressed, Alicia had noticed something odd. There were whispers, muted conversations, glances exchanged across the aisles. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted, the subtle tension in the air growing heavier with each passing minute. Alicia couldn't ignore the feeling that she had just become a pawn in a larger game. She adjusted in her seat, trying to shake off the restless energy that seemed to cling to her. The seat itself was comfortable, far more so than anything she had experienced during her weeks at sea, but it did little to ease her mind. Alicia wasn't used to being in the dark. She was a problem solver by nature. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Her thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice broke through her concentration. "Commander Turner?" She looked up, startled for a moment, then relaxed when she saw the flight attendant standing nearby. It was the same attendant who had greeted her earlier. The woman's expression was polite, but there was something in her eyes, an unspoken understanding, that made Alicia sit up straighter. "Yes?" Alicia replied, her voice steady. The flight attendant hesitated before leaning in slightly, her voice lowered to a whisper. "There's been a slight development. It's about the man who was in your seat earlier." Alicia's pulse quickened. "What about him?" she asked, though her instincts were already screaming that this wasn't going to be good news. "He's not just any businessman, Commander," the flight attendant continued, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the plane's engines. "He's connected, very connected. His name is James Thornton, and he's been in the news more than once for. Well, let's just say his dealings aren't exactly above board." Alicia's brows furrowed as the information sunk in. Thornton. The name didn't ring any immediate bells, but she could tell it was important. There was something in the attendant's voice, something that told Alicia she was only scratching the surface of what was going on. "How so?" Alicia asked, leaning forward slightly, careful not to attract too much attention. The flight attendant glanced around quickly before lowering her voice even further. "I can't say too much, but let's just say Thornton has been linked to some, shall we say, unsavory organizations. People with power, people who don't like to be questioned. I'm not supposed to be saying this, but I've heard whispers among the crew. He's got a lot of influence, and he's got a lot of people in his pocket." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a random power play, it was something much more dangerous. Thornton wasn't just any influential person with money, he was a figure with the kind of power that could easily ruin lives, including hers if she wasn't careful. The attendant quickly straightened, as though realizing she had said too much, and gave Alicia an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, Commander. I shouldn't have said anything. But you should be aware that things might get complicated from here on out. Alicia nodded, her mind already working through the implications of this new information. Thornton wasn't just a man who wanted her seat, he was someone who operated in shadows, whose every move was calculated, and whose influence stretched far beyond the reaches of the airport or this flight. "Thank you for letting me know," Alicia said, offering a tight but appreciative smile. The flight attendant gave her a small nod and then retreated back into the galley, leaving Alicia alone with her thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers drumming absent-mindedly against the armrest as she considered her next move. She couldn't just let this go, not now that she knew Thornton's connections. She had to dig deeper, find out exactly who he was and what he wanted from her. But she also knew that going after Thornton, especially with the kind of people he likely surrounded himself with, would put her in even more danger. She wasn't afraid of danger, that was a part of the job. But she wasn't naive enough to think she could take him on alone. She would need help. But who could she trust in a situation like this? The flight crew? They were clearly intimidated by Thornton, and Alicia couldn't blame them. They were just trying to do their jobs. But that left her with few options. The plane continued its journey, and Alicia's mind raced as she considered her next steps. She couldn't confront Thornton directly, not yet. She needed more information, more evidence to understand the full scope of his reach. But how could she gather that information without drawing his attention? Without putting herself and possibly others in harm's way? Hours passed, and the flight began its descent. The rumble of the plane's descent brought Alicia back to the present. It was almost time to land, and as much as she hated to admit it, she didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear, this wasn't the end of her confrontation with Thornton. It was only the beginning. As the plane touched down, Alicia's thoughts were still focused on the tangled web she had unknowingly stepped into. The challenges she faced were far from over, and the stakes were higher than she had imagined. But as she stood up and prepared to leave the plane, her resolve only hardened. She wouldn't back down, not when the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And she would uncover it. No matter what it took, the final confrontation. The plane had touched down with a soft jolt, signaling the end of a journey that had been far more tumultuous than Alicia had expected. As the seatbelt signs clicked off, the usual bustle of passengers eager to exit filled the cabin. Yet, Alicia remained seated for a moment longer than most, her gaze focused out the small window at the sprawling airport below. The sky outside was painted with the pink and purple hues of the setting sun, but it felt like the calm before the storm. She had known when she boarded that there was more to this than just a first-class seat. Now, with every passing second, it was becoming clearer, this was not a simple mistake or misunderstanding. Thornton was not someone she could just brush off. He was a threat, a real one, and one she had yet to fully understand. The flight attendant passed by again, and Alicia caught her eye. There was something unspoken in the brief exchange of glances. The woman didn't stop this time, but her expression was enough. She knew there was more to this than anyone had been willing to say openly. Alicia wasn't about to let it slide, not after everything that had transpired. As the passengers began to leave, Alicia remained in her seat, pretending to check the notifications on her phone. The real task at hand had just begun. Thornton was still on the plane, and she had no intention of letting him slip away quietly into whatever world he inhabited. She had her suspicions, those quiet, lingering whispers about his connections, but she needed something more concrete. She needed leverage. A few minutes later, after the rest of the passengers had filtered off the plane, Alicia stood. Her muscles ached from the long flight, but it was nothing compared to the weight of what she was about to do. As she made her way toward the front of the cabin, she spotted Thornton exiting the cockpit area. He was talking to the pilot in low, muted tones, his back to her. Alicia's instincts flared. This wasn't a coincidence. Thornton had already orchestrated something. He had to have. But what? She took a deep breath and walked forward, her boots clicking against the floor with purpose. She was done being passive. She was going to confront him directly. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice calm and even, but with a steel edge. Thornton turned, his face breaking into the same condescending smirk she had seen earlier. His eyes flicked over her uniform, dismissing it immediately. But his smile faltered for a split second when he saw the intensity in her eyes. There was something about the way Alicia carried herself, something unyielding, that seemed to momentarily shake his confidence. "Commander Turner," he greeted her, his tone almost mocking. "Did you enjoy your seat? I trust you found it comfortable enough?" Alicia didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "You and I both know this is about more than a seat, Thornton. Don't play games with me." The shift in his demeanor was subtle but noticeable. For the first time, he seemed to pause, considering her words more carefully. His posture straightened slightly, but he didn't back down. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice lowered to just above a whisper. "You're right," he said. "It's about much more than a seat. But I'm afraid you don't quite understand the full scope of the situation, Commander. You really think you can stand up to me? To the people I answer to?" Alicia's pulse quickened, but her face remained impassive. "I'm not interested in who you answer to. I'm interested in what you want, Thornton. And how far you're willing to go to get it." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension thick between them. Alicia could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, but she didn't break eye contact. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Thornton chuckled softly, a sound devoid of real humor. "You have no idea, do you? You think this is just a seat on a plane, a misunderstanding, a simple power play? It's much bigger than that. You're in way over your head, Commander." "Then explain it to me," Alicia said, her voice low but firm. "I'm listening." For a second, Thornton seemed taken aback. But then his smirk returned, though it was laced with something darker now. "You really want to know? Fine. I'll tell you. But don't say I didn't warn you." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an even lower murmur. "I work for a very powerful group of people. People who don't like to be crossed. I'm in the business of acquisitions. I find people, resources, things that are valuable, and I make sure they're in the right hands. People like you, Commander, are pawns in the game we play. People with power, with influence. People who think they can stand against the tide. But in the end, everyone has a price. Even you." Alicia's stomach twisted with disgust, but she didn't let it show. This was the moment she had been waiting for, finally, some clarity on what was really going on. But now, she had more questions than ever. "And what exactly do you want from me?" Thornton smiled, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "Oh, it's not about what I want, Commander. It's about what they want. You're just the means to an end. And whether you like it or not, you've already made yourself a part of this game. The question now is, how long do you think you can survive in it?" Alicia's mind was racing as she processed his words. This wasn't just about money or influence. This was something darker, more sinister. She had stumbled into a world of power plays, manipulation, and corruption, a world where people like Thornton operated with impunity. But Alicia wasn't about to be a pawn in anyone's game. She would not be bought or threatened. Before she could respond, the cabin door opened, and a man in a suit stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to command immediate respect, or fear. Alicia didn't need to be told who he was. Thornton's smirk faltered as the man walked toward them. He didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge him in any way, but the subtle shift in his demeanor told Alicia everything she needed to know. This man was important, perhaps even more so than Thornton himself. Alicia's instincts flared again. She could feel the walls closing in on her. She wasn't going to let herself be trapped. Not like this. Who are you? Alicia asked, her voice steady despite the rising sense of danger. The man stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze scanning her with cold, calculating eyes. My name is Viktor Karpov, he said, his accent thick but clear. And you are in my way, Commander. It would be wise for you to step aside before things get complicated. Alicia didn't move. She stood her ground, every muscle tensed, her mind working at lightning speed to assess the situation. Karpov, Thornton, they were part of something much bigger than she had imagined. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. I'm not going anywhere, she said, her voice low, resolute. You'll have to make me.